Craig Pittman is a native Floridian, an author, a podcaster, and an award-winning environmental reporter. Born in Pensacola, he graduated from Troy State University in Alabama. In 31 years at the Tampa Bay Times, Pittman covered a variety of beats and several natural disasters, including wildfires, hurricanes, and the Florida Legislature. He now writes a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix and is co-host of the popular podcast Welcome to Florida. He is the author of 6 nonfiction books about Florida, including the New York Times bestsellers Oh, Florida and Cattail. His most recent book, The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife, was published in September 2021. He lives in St. Petersburg with his wife and children. Craig will be joined in conversation today by Bill Delaney. Bill Delaney is a... Bill Delaney is a much-loved writer, editor, and higher education professional from Jacksonville, whose work focuses on the culture and history of the First Coast. He is co-owner and editor of the publications Modern Cities, The Jackson, and Edible Northeast Florida magazine. In September of last year, he published his first book, Secret Jacksonville, A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure, which was featured in a Lit Chat in December that you can find on the library's YouTube channel and podcast. So now, Bill, I leave the rest to you.
Don't forget to applaud after everything he says.
Yeah. Now, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited. This is my first time meeting Craig, but I've been reading your stuff for a very long time, so I think
Have
it's
you finished it yet?
Yeah. No, I don't think I'll ever be finished.
Okay.
All right. So to kick things off, Craig, I want to talk a bit about your background because it's evident in everything you've written that you have a very deep experience with this state. You're not only a Florida author, you're a Florida born and bred author. And You've talked about how somebody who's been here for a long time and seen all the changes really has a different perspective than just people who were born here. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. You've probably experienced this. Anybody who's from Florida, you, as one guy told me, you're like the kid in The Sixth Sense. You're always seeing stuff that's not there that nobody else can see because you remember the way things were. You remember what it was like. And by the way, since we're both Florida natives, I'm assuming a Fish and Wildlife Service officer will come here and tag us in a minute, since we're an endangered species. So don't panic if that happens. But yeah, I grew up in the Panhandle. I grew up in Pensacola, and my parents were from farms in the Panhandle, and I have a great uncle, and I talk about him in the book. My great uncle Carl, who actually traced our family back to 1850. First arriving in Florida, apparently looking for a good deal on waterfront condos, and when you've been in one place for a long time, you feel like you know it. But I have to say that the more time I spend looking at Florida and looking into Florida stories, I'm constantly finding stuff I didn't know that's just it was there. Nobody asked about it, but if it's sort of one of those things where if you kind of keep your mind open and keep your ears open and your eyes open, you'll find things that will just blow your mind.
All right, so for many years you were a journalist, including, 30-something years at the Tampa Bay Times.
31 years at the Tampa Bay Times. Now I write a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix on environmental issues. It features lots of bad puns and pop culture references, so if that's your thing.
So you've been doing the environmental beat for a long time. Do you
Yes.
find that a difficult beat to cover?
No, good Lord, no. I'll never run out of Florida stories, and it doesn't seem like I'll run out of Florida environment stories, many of which are some of the really crazy stuff, like pythons battling alligators in the Everglades, a religious cult that smuggled gigantic African snails into the U.S. because they thought drinking their mucus would make you healthy. It actually had the opposite effect.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Well, everybody's shown up in the ER is how the authorities found out about it. And then to get rid of them, the state actually bought and trained dogs, snail-sniffing dogs. So I think Florida's the only state where they had snail-sniffing dogs. Although I feel bad for the dogs. I figure they go back to the kennel at night and the other dogs are bragging, hey, I just sniffed out some drugs today. How about you? I just sniffed out some bombs. How about you? I sniffed out some snail mucus. It's a living. But yeah, I mean, the environment is just a great beat because it's sort of the intersection of politics, the law, and science, and that's an uneasy intersection. Believe me, that's worse than one of the roundabouts. People trying to figure it out. So it's something where there's a lot to write about there's some developers who are so crazy that you would need, if they didn't exist, Carl Heisen would have to make them up. I wrote about one just not too long ago who was going to turn this land near Yeehaw Junction into a new development called Destiny. And he was one of these guys who he actually wore alligator shoes with alligator eyes on them. And his home had a moat. And he bought for the moat a chiller so that the fish in the moat wouldn't overheat. And he wound up going to prison because he was ripping off his partner.
Man, imagine that, somebody in alligator boots ripping off their partner.
I know. But, this really is a sunny place for shady people, so there's lots of that going around.
So your first book was called Paving Paradise. It was written with Matthew Waite.
Yes. Or as I call him, Dr. F-Bomb.
Dr. F-Bomb.
Yes. He's a professor now in Nebraska.
So the subtitle is Florida's Vanishing Wetlands and the Failure of No-Net Laws. What was the genesis?
It just screams out for Hollywood, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, to me, I find that extremely fascinating. I've loved everything that you write about the environment. I think you have a really great way of making it
Thank you.
Entertaining in addition to informative. But what was the genesis of that book?
Well, it started at a Christmas party, of all things. I was at a party one of my editors threw, and one of his neighbors was a guy named Roy. He introduced him to me as Roy Gardner. His name's Royal Gardner, and he was a dean at Stetson Law School. But before that, Roy had been the top lawyer for the Army Corps of Engineers, and we started chatting, and then like a month or two later, he called me out of the blue because I had said, hey, if anything comes up on the environment you think I ought to know about, let me know. So he called me and said, there's this new report that just came out from the National Academy of Science. And I said, excuse me, I'm yawning. And he said, no, wait. And it quotes a bunch of Florida cases, and it's talking about how America's system for protecting wetlands doesn't work, and most of the wetlands that are being wiped out are in Florida. And I said, oh, okay, that could be a story. So I ordered up the report. And, it was written in a very academic style, but the longer I stuck with it and looked for the verbs, the more my eyebrows shut up because, holy cow, basically it said this whole system's a sham. On paper it looks good that we're protecting wetlands, but we're really not, and the whole system for mitigation is just bogus. And so I started calling people and looking things up, and sure enough, the Corps was issuing more permits for wetlands destruction in Florida than anywhere else in the country. In fact, in 1 year, they issued 12,000 permits to destroy wetlands in Florida. Can you guess how many they turned down? One. That guy was so mad. 12,000 people got a yes. He was the one who got a no. He wanted to build a hotel on property next to Everglades National Park that was covered in mangroves, and he didn't see what was wrong with that. And so I paired up with Matt, who's a computer guy. They call it computer-assisted reporting, as if computers don't help with everything you do. Mm-hmm. But he was an expert on GIS, because our idea was we would map where the wetlands had been, and then we would show where they were, what had happened to them. And we put in a public records request, a Freedom of Information Act request with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they fought us for a year, and we didn't understand why. And then finally we got it, and we understood why, because a lot of it was junk. They really weren't tracking it. I mean, they gave us data points that were out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or up in Pennsylvania. And finally, we said, what's going on? They said, well, we're just so busy issuing more permits, we don't have time to look back. Mm-hmm. So how do you know if you're doing your job? Well, we're just issuing the permits. And then after they'd issue a permit, they'd actually send out a customer service survey to ask the developers, hey, how are we doing? Did we give you your permit quick enough? So we ended up doing this, and Matt actually took 2 college courses on GIS mapping to learn how to do this. So we did what the Corps should have been doing, which is we mapped out where the wetlands were in Florida in 1990 when the whole no-net loss policy was adopted by the federal government, and then we mapped where they were in 2004, or rather what was left of them, and we found that 84,000 acres had been wiped out by paving, houses, you name it. And we took that to the Corps, and they said, well, okay, number one, we wish we could do that. But number two, you shouldn't just look at all the things we say yes to. You should look at how we reduce the amount of wetlands that are approved for getting rid of. We said, we think if we reduce it like 90%, that's a big victory. He said, great. How much have you reduced it? Well, we're not really keeping track of that. But we found out that they were filing paper reports to the Pentagon every 3 months. They call these quarterlies. And that all the copies of the quarterlies were being kept in the desk of this one secretary named Nancy. So we, in effect, put in a Freedom of Information Act request for Nancy's desk. And we got all these paper reports, and we built a spreadsheet, and we figured out that they were, when a developer would come in and request a permit to wipe out 100 acres of wetlands, they would reduce that to 90 acres of wetlands. And that was their big victory. And we said, that's bad. It's really bad. And so we ran this big story about it. And it was a big series. We actually went out to a lot of the wetlands that had been wiped out and wrote about it. We talked to current and retired Corps of Engineers employees who had just been dying to tell somebody this whole program is nothing but window dressing. And we won several national awards for the stories. And then a guy named Gary Mormino, who is a professor at the University of South Florida and has written some wonderful books about Florida, he said, have you guys thought about turning that into the book? And we said, no. And he said, I'm going to bring you to a meeting with some publishers from the University Press and write up a one-page pitch. And we did, and they loved it, and so that's where the book came from.
Very cool. Yes.
That was more than you wanted to know.
No, no.
I have a tendency to do that. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think that it's any more. I think that everybody here is is going to find it interesting. But your next book was called Scent of Scandal.
No. The next book was Manatee Insanity.
Oh, next book was Manatee Insanity.
Because the Paving Paradise sold so well, the University Press people said, that was great, what else you got? And I said, well, the most divisive thing I write about is manatees. And they said, well, write us something on that. So I wrote Manatee Insanity, and it came out in hardback, and hardly anybody bought it. And it's my least successful book, but because manatees are back in the news now, they're putting out a paperback version this fall. 12 years later, and they gave me all of 2 pages to sum up what's happened in the last 12 years.
Yeah. So I found interesting about that is kind of the difference between writing a column where you need to be concise and get to the point versus stretching it out to a whole book.
It was my second book. I was still learning.
Yeah.
I thought I had to empty my entire notebook in there.
Yeah. So did you find that difficult, a difficult transition to make?
Yes. Yeah, it was. And I think I finally succeeded with the third book, the one you just mentioned, Scent of Scandal, because Paving Paradise was sort of a work of investigative and history writing about Florida wetlands. And Manatee Insanity is basically an environmental history. But the Scent of Scandal is just a good yarn. It's about how this one flower stirred up so much trouble. A guy smuggled it in from Peru, took it to Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, and Selby Gardens, because they welcomed him in and wrote about it and named this unknown species, wound up facing criminal charges. They were the first scientific institution in America to face charges for wildlife trafficking, which is just a great story,
Yeah, I had to say, if you've ever read the book, The Orchid Thief, this is an even crazier story than that.
Yes, and they both have this. They both share one character who's probably the craziest character of them all, Lee Moore, whose nickname is the Adventurer. And if you didn't know that was his nickname, he would make sure you knew because he put it on his business card and his letterhead too. He had repeatedly dodged death, dodged the authorities, and at one point I made the mistake of calling Lee an orchid smuggler to his face, and he got very offended. And he said, "No, I never smuggled orchids. I used the orchids to hide what I was really smuggling." Can I just mention? And by the way, this book, as far as I know, is the only book ever classified as true crime / gardening. So I always feel bad for the library clerks trying to figure out where that goes.
So in 2016, you wrote "Oh Florida," which has about the best cover art that I've ever seen. It's pretty amazing. Now, apparently, this book took a long path to getting published.
Well, yeah. How can I explain this? In 2013, I always say this is the book that grew out of my Twitter account, which is sort of true. I would tweet stuff on my Twitter account, and I would tag it "Oh Florida." It would be those crazy Florida stories, like Florida man dials 911 because strip club won't let him bring his cat in, things like that. And so an editor at Slate contacted me right before the trial of the guy who shot Trayvon Martin and said, listen, Florida's going to be in the news for a while. Can you blog about other aspects of Florida and try and explain Florida to people for a month? And I said, just a month? So I wrote something like 22 blog posts, and they were all tagged "Oh Florida." And towards the end, the editor said, "This has been fun. I hope you turn this into a book." And I said, "Oh well, maybe I should." And about that time, I got contacted by an agent in New York who said, "Listen, we're thinking that 2016 would be a good year to put out a book about Florida because, of course, every 4 years, the rest of the nation gives Florida the side eye and wonders how we're going to screw things up again. So, when we saw your blog, and we were thinking you're the guy to write it." And I said, "Okay." So he sent me a format for a book proposal. I wrote it up. We sent it around. I think 15 publishers said, "No, this is horrible. Who wants to read about Florida, blah." And then one, St. Martin, said, "Yes, this is a great idea," and published it, and it got rave reviews in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and it made the New York Times bestseller list for all of a week, which is just enough for them to slap that on the paperback version. New York Times bestseller. And I have to say, it's still selling. You know, so what has it been, 6 years later?
Yeah.
It's still selling. I still get royalty checks on that one, which is, that's really nice. And I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see my baby out there doing well. And I seriously thought about sending thank you notes to all the people that didn't believe in it to say, you would not have pushed it the way St. Martin's did, so thank you for rejecting it.
So in that book and in other things you've written, you talk a lot about, Florida's weirdness, and you say that it's effectively innate.
Yes.
And apparently also contagious.
Yes.
When people come here or in any way interact with Florida, that the weird kind of rubs off on them.
By the way, I hope y'all left your machetes outside today.
Yeah.
and your emotional support gator.
Yeah. And so how, in your estimation, how did we get so weird?
How much time we got? The weirdness started even before we were a state. Back when we were a territory, there was a visitor who came here in the 1830s and said that he thought half the people who lived here were rogues and scalawags, and the other half were their penniless victims. So, not much has changed. And in 1845, when we became a state, the first flag to fly over Tallahassee actually said, "Let us alone," which you could take as either a wish or a warning. There's just been so many incidents that have happened over the years showing off what a weird place this is. The examples are multiple. I mean, and everything that pops up that I read in history just verifies it. I mean, and I think this is in Florida, that the deal to finally sell Florida to the United States from Spain, no money actually changed hands. They were like, "Here, you take it." And the other thing was that this was all fallout from the War of Jenkins' Ear, which if you're gonna name a war, that's not a serious name to give to a war. The War of Jenkins' Ear. That's how Florida wound up becoming the United States' problem, and everybody in Florida looking at Washington and saying, "Don't say we didn't warn you." There are a lot of factors that produce a lot of the weird stories you see out of Florida. One is, that we've had this wrenching demographic change happen here. In 1940, we were the least populated southern state, which makes sense when you consider there was no bug spray and no air conditioning back then. And as of 2014, we're the third most populous state. We actually passed New York. And the 22 million people here, we're not evenly spread over the whole peninsula. We're kind of crammed in that 30-mile wide swath along the coast and along I-4 where the theme parks are. So you pack that many people together into that small a space in that short a length of time, and they're all coming from different cultures and speak different languages. They're bound to start ramming into each other's cars and, chasing each other with machetes and arguing over whose dog pooped on whose lawn. That's going to happen. And bear in mind who the people are. I mean, we've got we've got strip club moguls, we've got monkey breeders, we've got spam kings, we've got uniformed Scientologists, we've got Hooters waitresses. I mean, we've got retired CIA agents. I mean, retired CIA agents took over Sanibel Island and turned it into a town. That's just not something that happens in other states. So, and you know, we've got, the temperature means we're out doing weird stuff all year long. We're not cramped up inside like during a blizzard like in Ohio. There are a lot of machetes. I actually talked to a machete distributor who said he sells more machetes in Florida than anywhere else, which blew my theory, which was that they were giving them away free at the state line with cups of orange juice. And I always have to mention that we are generally ranked 49th in the nation for funding for mental health treatment, to which I can only say thank God for Texas.
Yeah, so you have a quote at the start of Florida.
Yes.
That is from Lawrence P. Lessing that says, Florida is a
Give
study.
the date. Give the date.
Yeah, I'll give him the date in a second.
Okay.
I want to hear the quote first. Florida is a study in abnormal psychology, useful in signaling the derangements of the national mood. And he wrote that in 1948. So apparently this whole concept goes back a very long time.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you do say elsewhere in the book and in other things you've written that some of our weirdness is inherited from the folks who have moved here.
Yes.
You know, we didn't go from being the smallest state to the third biggest just by population growth. It was people moving here.
Yeah.
You noted that fully 5 major candidates in the 2016 presidential election were full-time or part-time Florida residents, including Donald Trump, who won, but only one of them actually was born here. Now, would you say that a good part of our weird is an invasive species?
Well, how do you mean that? Do you mean the weirdness itself is invasive?
I mean that people are moving here and they're bringing the weird with them, and it's just concentrated.
Oh, yeah,
here.
because you know, I always tell people you find weirdness wherever you find people, because people are weird. They're just weird. They can't help it. But when you bring it here, it's like it gets multiplied, because then their weirdness bounces off everybody else's weirdness, and you're kind of stuck in that. You get stuck in that groove like they used to do with records. So yeah, I wouldn't call it invasive. I mean, it's like they're adapting to their to their atmosphere. I thought you meant is weirdness connected to invasive species, because of course it's that too. I mean, you know, what other state has pythons?
Yeah.
Number one, and number two, what other state actually employs python hunters? Because that's one of the jobs that is found only in Florida. The other one being mermaid. Florida's the only state that has mermaids on the government payroll. If anybody ever been to Weeki Wachee Springs, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. The mermaid, there used to be a classic Florida roadside attraction, and then in the 2000s, the business sort of tailed off. And then the state, rather than see it bought by a developer or a water bottler, stepped in and bought it, turned it into a state park, and the mermaids became state employees, which has led to some interesting conversations about the use of tax dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. But I mean, that's part of what makes Florida unique, and I contend we should celebrate that. We should not be ashamed of it. Some of my friends are absolutely horrified. My friends who are natives, they're like, oh my God, every time a big story comes up, there's always a Florida angle. Like, remember the woman who got in trouble for trying to bring her emotional support peacock on board a plane? The peacock was from Florida. But I tell them, no, don't be like that. You should embrace the weird. Let your Florida freak flag fly, and just be proud of the fact that we are not like everywhere else.
Go towards the weird.
Exactly.
Step into the weird.
Yes. Embrace the weirdness.
All right, now I want to talk about your 2020 book, Cattail, for a minute.
Yes.
So I found this book absolutely riveting, and that's definitely not an easy feat. The book is about the preservation of the Florida Panther and the stops and starts that it had. You know, again, like with Manatee Insanity and the book with the orchids, like, how did you pull that off? How did you turn it into essentially a full-length book and keep it that interesting?
Well, I've been, I started writing about panthers when I started covering the environment in 1998, and every time I would write a story about trying to save the Florida panther, I'd think this would make a great book. There are fascinating characters. There's lots of twists and turns in the plot. What I didn't have was an ending, and you really need an ending if you're going to write a book. So I held off and, went off and did other stuff. But then about 5 years ago, I finally got something I thought, okay, that could make a good ending. And so I sat down and wrote the book proposal, and we sent it around. And ran into the same reaction. People like, Florida, we don't care. But one publisher said, we loved Florida, and we love this. So they put that out. And I think it holds up because it does have fascinating characters. There's a biologist in it, for instance, who actually gives a dying panther mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which honestly is a level of a commitment to the job you seldom see in America these days. The part of the book that is actually sort of the low point, where they think panthers are lost and they'll never get them back, is also the funniest chapter, because that's the part where the trapper gets sent out to Texas. And I don't want to give too much away, but let me just mention the words blindfolded mule, and let that tantalize you, because it's hysterical. And when Roy finished telling me the story, I said, Roy, why haven't you ever told anybody that story before? Nobody asked. So there you go.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah. I mean, and Roy, one of the main characters in the book is a guy named Roy McBride, who's this very reticent, manly man, Texas hunter, who he made his reputation killing wolves and mountain lions out in Texas and in Mexico. And when the Endangered Species Act passed, panthers were on the first endangered species list, along with key deer, manatees, and the alligator, by the way. You wouldn't believe it, but alligators used to be considered endangered. And so the World Wildlife Fund actually hired Roy to come to Florida and see if there were any panthers left. And he found one, and he found signs of a few more, but not too many. And so Roy wound up getting sucked into the whole panther story. And so he's like my Zelig. He pops up at really key moments all throughout the story, because this sort of converted him from a hunter who kills to a guy who hunts to preserve the panther, and he really became sort of a champion of the panther. And he's a really fascinating character, but he doesn't like talking about himself, and it was really hard to get him to say stuff. And finally I said, Roy, it's not that I'm going to depict you as a hero or anything, but you're a witness. You saw stuff nobody else saw, and if you don't tell me the stories you have, then I won't be able to tell the whole story of the panther. Okay. So
I'll do it for the Panthers.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'm glad he did. And so there aren't too many heroes in this story, but he's one, and another is the veterinarian who first discovered that the panthers had genetic defects, Melody Relke, and who had a really hard time convincing her male bosses that what she'd found was a serious problem, because this was the 80s, 90s. A lot of the men in charge didn't think women knew what they were talking about, and she had to really convince them. And when they figured it out, they were like, doing, so.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found interesting, not to give too much away, but that even the people who were working or supposed to be working to save the panther couldn't agree on what to do.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things that intrigues me, I'm not going to give too many details, one of the things that intrigued me about the story is there's a guy who starts off a hero and then does what the people in the World Wrestling Federation refer to as a heel turn.
Yeah.
And winds up becoming sort of the biggest enemy that the Panthers got. And so, it was interesting to see that how people changed, that they weren't all one way, and they didn't all have, there weren't angels and demons fighting here, but real people who had real problems. And one of the big problems they had was the panther doesn't neatly fit into the categories that they have for endangered species, because it's hard to protect. But they felt like they needed to do it because Florida's school children picked them to be the state animal. And if they hadn't done that, I think the state would have been like, okay, panthers, bye, we don't need you anymore. But it's a state animal, and that would be like, buying a Lamborghini and naming it the governor's official sports car and then having it stolen. That would just be embarrassing if the state animal went extinct. So that's why they were willing to take chances and spend money. And so I always say the school children saved the panther in the end. That's what did it.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I did find it, I thought you did a really good job of balancing even people that seem to have kind of the darker motivations. You presented them as real people.
Yeah.
And you presented how they came to the conclusions they did. Without just making it.
And the one guy still has really good friends who are really mad at me for the book, and they, I kept telling them, well, I feel like I bent over backwards to be fair to him. No, you didn't. And I was like, yeah, I did my best. What can I do?
Yeah, I think you did a great job with
Thank
it. Of course, I am not his old friend that's trying to defend him.
Yeah.
So, what do you think is the state of the Florida Panther now?
They're doing better than they were. I mean, in 1995, there were maybe 20 or 30 of them left, and they were really circling the drain. And now there are roughly 200 out there slinking around in what wilderness we have left in Florida. They have a couple of problems. One is, and as I point out in the book, that while the population was coming back, the Fish and Wildlife Service was handing away development permits for their habitat. So we've got more panthers than ever before squeezed into a smaller space than ever before. The other problem is that, and because of that, there's conflicts. Just recently, and I wrote about this in a column for the Florida Phoenix, the Fish and Wildlife Service, was going to actually kill a panther because it kept eating calves belonging to a politically influential rancher. And the state's panther biologists were all dead set against this and kept making their case. And I put in a public records request and got 400 emails exchanged back and forth where they were discussing this in very heated terms and wrote about it. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service says, well, we're going to put a pause on that plan. I'm very sorry to say they did not spell pause, P-A-W-S. I think that would have been the perfect time for that pun. The other problem they have is that there's a disease that's been going around among not just panthers but also bobcats that cause them problems using their back legs. And they, after I think 3 or 4 years, they still don't know much about it. They don't even know if it's a natural disease or if it's caused by ranchers putting out rat poison, which is still a possibility. So, but it doesn't appear to be spread like from the adult panthers to the kittens. So that's a good sign. So we'll see what happens with that.
Now, you told me that you've only ever seen 3 panthers before.
Yes.
I've lived here my whole life. I've never seen one in the wild. But if you want to see a 4th and a 5th panther at the Jacksonville Zoo, they have some on exhibit
very nice.
there.
Very nice. You can see lots of them on license plates. That's,
yeah.
You know, and this, because this is Florida, this is the way we pay for our science, is through the sale of license plates for the cars that then go out and run over the panthers. So
and bring people to all these outlying developments that
yes.
keep getting built and
yes.
taking away their
but
habitat.
if you want to do something personal to help the panther, go buy a panther license plate. If you want to help manatees, go buy a manatee license plate. Same thing. That's how we pay for the science that is done in order to protect them, is we sell license plates, because that's how many cars we have on the roads.
All right, so your most recent book is The State You're In.
Shown here.
Shown here.
Yes.
Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife. And you collect pieces that you've written over a long time. Lots of great stories in there. So what was the genesis of this one?
The genesis of this one was Florida. After the book came out, I went around plugging it, and 2 things happened everywhere I went. One was everybody came up to me afterwards and said, let me tell you my Florida story, some of which I cannot repeat, some of which I can. I think my favorite one was the couple who told me that they had accidentally discovered their new neighbors were running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast. And the way they found out is they gave their kids a trampoline for Christmas. But the other thing that happened was that people kept saying, we want a sequel. When are you going to write a sequel? I'm saying, well, the book just came out. Yeah, but we read that. We want a sequel. We want another one. Well, I feel like I said what I wanted to say with that one. Well, no, there's so much more you could say. You need a sequel. So I kept thinking about this. I went off and wrote Cattail, but I kept thinking, how could I do a sequel to that? And then finally I said, well, maybe I wouldn't do O Florida 2, but maybe I could do Son of O Florida. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is. It's a collection of 51 stories and columns I've written about Florida that sort of celebrate its glorious weirdness, I guess you'd say, just the way O Florida did. So there are stories in there about not just the government mermaids at Weeki Wachee, but that they have actually spawned a mermaid industry all over the state. And my favorite mermaid, by the way, was the Puerto Rican woman from Fort Lauderdale who said, I'm 47, thank God water lifts. I wrote about nudists, because Florida's got more nudist resorts than any other state. And these particular nudists were fighting with the Postal Service about their packages. Literally, they were not getting their packages from the Postal Service. I wrote about the most tattooed woman alive and her love story, which started in a tattoo parlor. Mm-hmm. There's stories about fugitives, con men, rodeo cowboys, Same old stuff we always write about in Florida. There's two women who go out and hunt pythons on the weekends. During the week, they run a dog grooming salon in St. Pete, and then when the weekend comes, they grab their camping gear and go down to the Everglades and catch pythons, because, why not? That's the way to spend a weekend, right? And I actually went with them, and that was interesting. We rode around for 6 hours on the levees in the Everglades looking for pythons and didn't see any. And finally I said, well, I'm kind of disappointed I didn't see a python. Oh, you want to see one? Oh. And then they pull this box out from behind where I'd been sitting all night and open it up, and inside this white cloth bag is an 8-foot python they had caught the night before, and they'd just been driving around with it. Oh, you just wanted to see one. Oh, here you go. And it's a classic example of stuff you didn't know about that suddenly pops up. So while we're driving around, we pass by another python hunter, a better-known python hunter, Dusty Crum, who stars in his own reality show, Guardian of the Glades, where he runs around barefoot and has a body cam that shows him catching pythons. And they said hello, and he hadn't been catching any either that night. And then they drive, and I said, wow, that's really coincidence running into him. Well, not really. Most of the python hunters all camp out in the same place. I said, what do you mean? Yeah, there's a campground next door to the Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, and that's where the python hunters sleep during the day, and then they go out at night to look for the snakes. And I thought, why are they bothering with pythons? If they caught a skunk ape, they'd be famous.
Yeah, a lot more money. Yeah, I like the idea of like this Justice League of python hunters, like all hanging out together and joining the fight. Now, you wrote in this book a number of interesting crime stories, of the type that you often hear about Florida. But one of my favorite things, you and I are quote unquote Florida writers.
Yes.
But I really liked that you did some profiles on some previous Florida crime writers. It's novelists, fiction writers like John McDonald, who wrote the Travis McGee stories, Elmore Leonard, and Charles Wilford, who wrote Miami Blues, among other things. Now, you write nonfiction.
Yes.
But it really feels like, especially when you're writing about crime, that what you write could have been from their stories. Like, do you find a kinship with these fiction writers?
Oh, yeah. Well, as I explained in the John D. McDonald piece, I grew up in a family where everybody read murder mysteries growing up. My grandfather worshipped at the altar of Perry Mason, both the TV show and the books. My mom, big fan of Agatha Christie, loves the Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple books. And so I started out with Encyclopedia Brown and then moved on to Sherlock Holmes and then, Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. And one day when I was 14, my great aunt cornered me, and she had in one hand she had a paperback book, and in the other hand she had her Pall Mall, and she took a big drag in the Pall Mall and said, "I think you're ready for Travis McGee now." And she handed me the paperback book, and it had this scantily clad woman on the cover. And, I'm a 14-year-old boy. Yes, ma'am, I'm absolutely ready for that. But what I didn't realize was that what was inside, once you got past the lurid cover, was this great writing and a real sensitivity to the Florida environment. Because McDonald, who lived in Sarasota and did almost all of his writing there, he was an early environmental activist before we even really knew the term. In fact, his non-McGee novel, Flash of Green, is considered to be the first environmental novel published in the United States. It came out in 1962, the same year Rachel Carson put out Silent Spring. So, and that's why I wrote about those stories. And also, it's sort of one of the themes of the book is Florida stories and Florida storytellers. And so that's why those writer profiles are in there, and also why the book ends with talking about my great uncle, who was sort of the first Florida storyteller that I recognized as a Florida storyteller. He was telling me stories about our family. I see someone approaching over your shoulder.
Okay. I think it's time for some questions.
Yes.
Thank you, Craig.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the conversation so far. This has been great. Wait, we're not done yet.
And so far, nobody's thrown any fresh fruit at me, so that's good.
We can clap for everything. That's fine. So now we're going to open up to questions from the audiences here at the Beaches Library and our friends on Zoom. So if you're here in person, check under your seat for a clipboard and pen. It might be under your neighbor's seat, depending on where you're
I
sitting.
didn't get one.
And just write down your questions on the note cards. I will come around and collect those questions and bring them up here for Bill to ask. And we'll start with a couple questions we've collected from the Zoom audience.
Hi, Zoomers.
Oh, careful. You okay? All right, first up. Do you find Orlando to be a funny place in any way?
Oh, good Lord, yes. How could you not find Orlando to be amusing? I mean, that's, I mean, I find a lot of stuff amusing that some people might not. I mean, I think it's hysterically funny that Nazis are marching around outside Disney World now. It's like, do you understand the irony of this? I guess that's the thing. If you live in Florida any length of time, you will never suffer from an irony deficiency. So that's a big reason. But yeah, there's a lot of humor everywhere you go in Florida. Here in Jacksonville. I have to tell you this. Mm-hmm. I have no explanation for this, but when I pulled in onto the street that led me to my hotel last night, there was a man dressed as a Greek Orthodox priest, full outfit, the black outfit, black cap, and he was shaking a Coptic cross at every car that came by. I don't know why. But, welcome to Jacksonville.
Yeah. He may not even know why.
Yeah.
All right, next up. Do you ever write a funny angle to a disaster, such as a building collapse or a house swallowed by a sinkhole, that would be in good taste, possibly years later after the shock and sadness has passed?
Oh, gosh, that's a tough question. I have... Florida, I mentioned about the guy who was he was asleep and was swallowed by a sinkhole and his family never saw him again. But that wasn't presented as funny, and it certainly wasn't funny to the family. I think anybody that's felt grief or pain understands that that's not necessarily something you want to make fun of it with others. And in fact, there's a piece in this book where I wrote about mugshots and how sometimes they don't tell the story you think they tell. But on the other hand, in Florida, I also told about a woman who went out in her backyard one day and fell into a new sinkhole and screamed until her neighbor came and helped her get out. And then a year later went in the backyard and fell into a different sinkhole. And fortunately, she had a cell phone then, and she was able to call 911 and the cops came. And my advice was, ma'am, just stop going in the backyard.
Okay, this commenter asks, the Razor Girl book by Carl Heisen, was that before or after your book?
Razor Girl came out a little bit after mine, and so did Dave Barry's, because Dave Barry tells the same story, and Florida has this. This woman inspired 3 different renditions of her story in 3 different books, which is just amazing. If you don't know the story, let me tell it briefly, which is she was driving in the Keys. She was on her way to a date. For some reason, she had her ex-husband in the passenger seat of her car, and she asked him to take the wheel while she continued operating the pedals because she needed to get ready for her date. And by get ready, I mean she took a razor out of her purse and began to shape up what the newspaper later referred to as her bikini area. Traffic in the Keys being what it is, you can probably guess the ending to this story. It was not pretty. But all I can say is Florida generally is ranked as having the worst drivers in America, I think because we have all the drivers in America on the interstate at the same time. And it yields stories like this, or my favorite road rage story, which was from Gainesville, where the headline was, "Man in road rage incident runs over self." Which, that takes a little doing when you think about it.
All right. This is a question for all of y'all. How many people in the audience are from out of state? Yep.
Uh-oh. Do we have a back exit we can get?
Yeah.
I think we're
Let's get out of here, Craig.
Welcome to Florida. You have made the right decision. We're so glad you're here. Because really, I mean, sometimes natives misguidedly criticize newcomers, but I don't do that because, you guys have a lot to contribute to our state, and not just the money you bring, although thank you for that. But, for instance, I always point out that our tourism industry was started by Harriet Beecher Stowe. who moved here after the Civil War, which she also started, and built a cabin on the St. Johns River and became our first tourist attraction too. You know,
Yeah,
they would actually
out in Mandarin, right near here.
Yes, they would take steamboats down the river past her house, and she'd come out and wave at them. And then they'd climb out of the boat and go steal oranges off her groves. But and then her brother Charles started our educational system. He's the first one who came up with the idea of 67 school districts. So, you know, these might have been condemned as carpetbaggers, but they made a major contribution to Florida. So, thank heavens for you guys making the right choice. And I'm not going to say now go home.
All right, now we're getting political here.
Uh-oh.
Using your crystal ball, can you predict who will be the GOP candidate in 2024 for Potus?
No, I cannot. But it will be someone from Florida.
That's a great answer. After your book on the wetlands, was there any change in the Army Corps process?
No. But there was a change in the people, which I thought was interesting. And actually, this came as a result of our series, that not long after the series was published, Walmart came to I think it was the St. Petersburg City Council Planning Commission. They wanted a change in the zoning for property that was almost entirely covered in mangroves because they were going to build a new Walmart supercenter there. Mm-hmm. And people came out of the woodwork to oppose it. And a lot of them were carrying our series in their hand and waving it around and saying, we learned from the paper that we have to stop this at this level. We can't wait until it gets higher. That this is where it stops. That we say, we've got a zoning map for a reason, and this is not a good reason to change the zoning. And they defeated it. And that Walmart never got built, all because people care about wetlands. So, and they took the right approach. They said, this is where we have to draw the line, and they did. But before, they had not really been paying attention to the local zoning process, and so there was nobody there to defend the zoning map, and so the developers got what they wanted.
So, I mean, that just goes to show you, Floridians can do anything.
Yeah,
They
even
fought
stop Walmart.
and won.
Yes.
All right. Do you know what percentage of Florida-born citizens younger than 35, which leaves the state of Florida for study or work?
No, I don't know the percentage. Generally speaking, 2/3 of the people that live here are from somewhere other than Florida. So 1/3 of us are natives, but a lot of those natives are kids who haven't made up their own minds on what they want to do yet. So, you know, will they leave? Will they come back? I don't know. It's a big question. And will more of them leave now than used to as we become more and more crowded? I don't know. But that's a question too. I guess the question we should ask is, how are you raising your kids? And are you making them appreciate the state they live in? Notice the plug. Or are you telling them maybe it's better off somewhere else? And so, you know, parents, it's kind of up to you. I mean, we've been talking a lot in state government about parents' rights. Well, I think a lot of it's up to the parents as to whether they convince their kids the state's worth fighting for or not.
Yeah, I have to say, in my experience, I know a lot of people that leave, but I also know a lot of those people that come back here later. Mm-hmm. You know, it could be kind of a regional thing. It may not be that way everywhere.
The Florida churn.
Yeah, the Florida churn. So why don't Floridians use their blinkers? Why is that, Craig?
Or, see, somebody needs to get a government grant to study this, because on the one hand, there are people who are convinced that nobody in Florida uses their blinker. On the other hand, the stereotype, at least in the Sarasota, Naples, Marco Island area, is that retirees put their blinker on, drive 3 miles, and then turn the other way.
Yeah.
In fact, I've actually heard that described as part of a Florida parade, that there's a car with Toronto plates that's going 30 miles an hour in a 45 zone with a left blinker on, and it's followed by 2 concrete trucks and a whole string of people cussing, and that's a Florida parade.
I love it. So do you find the current environment more difficult to report for example, with fake news, alternative realities? And if so, has that impacted your writing?
No, I mean, I think it's still about as hard as it ever was. I mean, there are a lot of... Florida has a long history of being in favor of open government, but not necessarily the politicians being in favor of it. We've got this groundbreaking sunshine law that I think is wonderful, and I would support making it mandatory for every politician to take training in the Sunshine Law, so that they understand this is for your protection as well as the protection of the public. But there are a lot more attacks on journalists these days than there used to be, but they tend to be virtual attacks, so I kind of shrug them off. It's like I wrote something that I actually asked a question that displeased the governor's press secretary, and she came after me on Twitter and sent her bots after me on Twitter, and I was like, you guys are ridiculous. Mute, 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 mute. And any Twitter account that has 4 numbers after the name and 0 followers, I'm not going to take it seriously.
No profile picture.
Yeah, or it's an egg. Yeah,
cartoon.
It's like, okay, so you're wasting a little bit of my time, but you're not really hurting me. As opposed to 20 years ago, I wrote a story that made a Pinellas County administrator very angry with me, and we stood in a parking lot, and he yelled at me for 20 minutes. And at one point he said, you haven't even been to the place you wrote about. And I said, yes, I have, Jake. I went out there and I took a whole tour. What? Yeah, I went out there and took a whole tour of the place. Oh, sorry. That was,
I do have to say, if you've really made it when you've gotten the governor's press secretary mad at you. It's like a rite of passage.
Well,
for
but she's mad at everybody.
Florida.
Unless you're like singing the praises of her boss, she's going to be angry the whole time. She's stuck in attack dog mode, which is, it's got to be hard on your private life to be like that. So did you have a good day, hon? What do you mean by that?
So Florida has a fair amount of military presence.
Yes.
Any humorous stories about the military here in Florida?
Oh, good Lord, yes. I grew up in Pensacola, the cradle of naval aviation, and where every Navy flyer, it was traditional. They all went to a place called Trader John's, which was a bar downtown. It was a strip joint. And they had barber chairs instead of bar stools, and Trader was known for wearing 2 different pairs of socks every day, and he offered a $10,000 reward if you ever caught him wearing matching socks, and nobody ever collected. I mean, it was just a great place, and a lot of city officials would hang out there and newspaper people. And in fact, we knew if it was after 6 and we needed somebody from City Hall, we went to Trader's rather than try and track him down at home. Trader's ended up closing after Trader John died, but there's a historic plaque in front of the strip joint, and the inside of Trader John's was recreated inside the local historical museum in Pensacola. So I would count that as, well. And the other thing I always love to mention about the military is that because of the Air Force, Eglin Air Force Base in the Panhandle is the largest Air Force base in the world, and one of the people who served there was Hunter Thompson, the father of gonzo journalism. And in fact, that's where his gonzo journalism career started. That's where he first came to realize, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro, which was the other quote I started over.
Yeah. So is humor the secret to dealing with Florida politics?
I think humor is the only option when dealing with a lot of Florida politicians. I mean, come on, we in the 1910s, we had a governor named Sidney Katz who always campaigned wearing a pair of 6 guns because he said the Pope had sent hitmen to kill him. So how else how else can you react to that other than to just historically laugh? We had a governor, and I mentioned this in Florida, who got elected because he wanted the job because he thought it was a ceremonial job, that he'd go around cutting ribbons and that kind of stuff. And instead, the day he took office, his predecessor called him in. This is Hayden Burns. They called him in and said, the state is broke, and you promised not to raise taxes, so good luck with that. Goodbye. And then left. He actually wrote a book while in office called How to Win Elections. He didn't win any more elections.
So did you major in journalism, and what led to your choice of college major?
I majored in journalism, and I minored in philosophy and art, which means I'm completely unemployable in any other field of endeavor other than the one I'm in. And I chose journalism because I wanted to write. I had this great plan, and I actually talk about this in the new book. I had this great plan that I was going to major in journalism, get my degree, work at a newspaper for 5 years, maybe go up to the New York Times and help them out, or Washington Post, someplace like that, and then quit and write the great American novel, sell it to Hollywood, and then, use that money and go around the world doing good deeds, somehow it did not work out that way. But it's great because, I became a journalist at my hometown paper in Pensacola, and that's where I really learned that Florida has lots of great stories to tell. And like I said, I will never run out of Florida stories. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It really is. So thank you to all of you for doing that.
So this may be our last question, and it's a good one. Is there any hope to overcome corruption and save Florida?
Good Lord, I hope not.
He'll be out of a job.
Yeah. It's like the guy hired to shoot rats at the dam, and he lets 3 or 4 go by, and then he shoots one, and they're like, why are you letting them go by? He said, I'd be out of a job. Seriously, though, there's a tremendous amount of money floating around in Florida politics, and that's why it corrupts. It just corrupts so many people who maybe started out with good intentions, or maybe they just wanted power. And so as long as there's lots of money floating around, that's going to happen. And, we need good journalists to expose the truth and show people what's really going on. And you guys need to pay attention to what they're writing about and stop. When people scream about fake news, just say, you don't know what you're talking about. Because if it's from Florida, it ain't fake. It's especially if it's crazy.
How would you even tell if it was fake?
Exactly. I don't know how Carl, I do know how Carl Heisen does it. He says he doesn't actually make anything up. He just reads the paper and changes the names.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
All right, fantastic. I'm going to learn my lesson. Let's do the round of applause. Amazing.
Wait, is this where I do the mic drop?
All right. So thanks to all of you for coming out to our Lit Chat this afternoon here at the beaches or on Zoom. And of course, thanks especially to Craig and Bill for an amazing conversation. I hope you all had a really great time here.